Hey everyone! Today we're going to continue with our Love, Treachery, and Other Terrors read aloud. We're going back to doing 2 chapters today, so we'll be doing chapter 22 and chapter 23. So, chapter 22, in which the twins only kill 2 people. Which twins? You'll have to find out. Fausta stood in the palace library, watching the twins. Acacia was browsing a nearby shelf. Jace was leaning back against a little work table, regarding Fausta with an amused grin. The place was empty, aside from the 3 of them. It wouldn't have mattered if it wasn't. The twins always kept her hidden, invisible, and unheard by anyone other than themselves. She was a silent spectator as they tortured her people and wreaked havoc on her nation. "Do you remember Damara?" Jace asked. Damara had been one of her handmaidens before Fausta found the twins. She had to dismiss her before the coup because she despised Justin and would never have believed a kind word about him. Fausta was sorry to see her go. She was a hard worker and the only one of her handmaidens who was honest with her. While the others only showered her in compliments, Damara would say things like, "What's wrong with your hair? No, you cannot enter the court like that." Then she would herd Fausta back to her chambers and redo everything. Fausta felt awful about letting her go, mostly because of her good work and loyalty, but also because she had a very young son to support. She assured her she would want for nothing, but that didn't stop Damara from sobbing and calling Fausta heartless. Fausta warned Damara that her boldness was going to get her in trouble one day. She was afraid that day had come. Damara, Fausta questioned. "She was a handmaiden of mine for a while. Why?" "Was she a friend?" Jace pressed. Fausta felt her heart starting to race, but she kept her expression blank. "She was just a servant," Fausta shrugged. "Do you know that she's in prison?" Fausta felt a knot in her stomach, but tried to act disinterested. She looked over his shoulder and noticed that Acacia had settled on a book. Since it was still chained to the shelf, she gave it a jerk, snapping the chain like thread. "Apollodorus's History of Calathea," Acacia read. She flipped it open with one hand and started violently flicking through the pages with the other. Fausta was grateful Alexander wasn't there to see her handling a book that way. Acacia skimmed one page, made an amused little snort, and snapped the book shut. "Oh, you got that wrong, Apollodorus," she smiled. Then all at once flames leapt up from her palm and consumed the text, leaving her hands dusted in ash. She brushed them off and continued browsing. "Aren't you going to ask me why she's in prison?" Jace pressed. "I don't really care," Fausta lied. "If you put her there, that's where she deserves to be." Jace's grin broadened. He could see right through her. "Let me fetch her for you," he replied. "Then she can tell you the whole story." Just then, Fausta noticed Damara standing between the 2 of them. She was glancing around in alarm, trying to gather her bearings. She was a few years younger than Fausta and looked remarkably good for someone who had been in prison. She had put her hair up and washed her face and kept her gown unwrinkled. It shouldn't have surprised Fausta. This was Damara's way. "My queen," Damara exclaimed. "What have these demons done to you?" Fausta jumped. Damara could see her. "You look awful," the handmaiden cried. Fausta swallowed a sigh. Her appearance was the last thing she was worried about at the moment. Jace grabbed Damara's shoulder and forced her around to face him. Then he looked at her with a gentle, sorrowful expression. "Damara, I want you to tell the queen what you've done," Jace insisted. "And then I want you to apologize." She tried to jerk away from him, but couldn't. "How about I tell her what you did first?" Damara snapped. "How you drowned Brother Nathan and then murdered that other man?" "Oh, Damara, Jace sighed. "As I explained, we did not drown him. He chose to jump overboard." "You could have saved him." "Now, Damara, my queen, one moment I was at home. The next moment I was in the middle of the ocean on a rickety boat crowded with a dozen others. All kinds of people, of every age and occupation, all as confused as I was. A few I knew, Brother Nathan for one, most I'd never seen. Then these 2 show up, standing on the water beside the boat, as if it were solid ground. They tell us if we don't throw someone out, We are all going to drown. Wait just a moment, Jace interrupted. That is not what we said. All we said was not to worry, that you would all figure out what needed to be done. It was that idiot at the bow who decided to throw someone out. I am sure you had no idea anyone was going to suggest that, Foster remarked. Jace shrugged. None whatsoever. So then, Damara continued, an argument broke out about who we should throw out. Most thought it should be this poor old man, since he didn't have long for this world anyway. Poor thing was terrified. A few jumped to his defense, and a fight broke out, and the water kept splashing in, and then dear brother Nathan jumped out. I had to admit I didn't see that coming, Jace said. I did, Acacia called. Remember, I told you beforehand. You did not, Jace objected. I certainly did, remember? I said that if we pick someone obsessed with the tales for the martyrs, they would sacrifice themselves for the others. After that, Damara continued, these two, they just disappeared, leaving us confused and abandoned. We drifted a day and a night before we saw land. Damara's cheeks flushed red and she scowled at Jace. Then, as we were climbing out onto the sand, frightened and grieving, these two have the audacity to appear and ask us what we learned. And what did you learn, Damara? Jace smiled. Damara suddenly became very quiet and looked at her feet. Tell the queen, Jace encouraged. You put it so eloquently that day. What did you learn? I told them, Damara hissed, that they are demons, and if they didn't crawl back to hell, I'd send them there myself. Foster raised her eyebrows. She knew there was a reason she liked Damara. And then everyone else got all riled up and started saying all kinds of hurtful things, Jace continued. And you started killing people, Damara accused. Stop exaggerating, Jace reprimanded. We only killed 2 people. We had to. They attacked us. One moment they were running forward and the next they dropped over onto the sand, Damara recalled, like their souls had just been plucked away. We wouldn't have had to kill them if you hadn't gotten everyone so worked up, Jace scowled. Which is why you must be punished. Acacia gasped. Foster heard the sound of another chain snapping. The remnant of it clattered against the shelving, causing both Damara and Jace to look over their shoulders at her. She held up a book for Jace to see. Reuven's on the Nature of Women, she pointed out. Then she incinerated it, as she had the first volume. I swear, every time I think I've destroyed the last copy, another one crops up. These idiots don't even have a printing press yet. How are they doing this? Jace rolled his eyes and turned back to Fosta. Sorry, where was I? Oh yes, punishing Damara. What should we do with her, my queen? Fosta knew that if she asked the twins to be merciful, they would sentence Damara to a slow and miserable death. However, if she suggested they put Damara to a slow and miserable death, they would listen. There was no hope for the poor, stupid girl. But Fosta decided she could at least offer her a small comfort. The corner of her lip turned upward in a subtle smirk. I don't punish my subjects for speaking the truth. A smile flickered across Damara's lips. You wound me, my queen, Jace sighed. I didn't realize you were so fragile, Fosta sneered. Jace grinned, which infuriated Fosta. She wished for just once they would get angry. They only ever seemed mildly amused or disinterested. Oh, Damara, 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 Jace sighed. Even the queen isn't immune to your corruption. Aren't you even a bit remorseful? Damara bit her lip and wrung her hands. She took a breath and said, No. Acacia strolled over with a book tucked under her arm. She was tossing an apple up and down with the opposite hand. She must have created it through magic because apples weren't in season. Where is Augustin? She asked. Fosta winced. Augustin was Damara's son. Damara smiled. Safe, hidden, someplace far from here. And your husband? I am a widow. Please, Acacia smirked. There are no Christians here. You don't have to tell us you're a widow. I am a widow, Damara defended. She is a widow, Fosta confirmed. She was not a widow. However, the lie was so well rehearsed that it caused no physical change in Fosta, and the twins could not detect it. Jace disappeared for a moment. When he reappeared, Damara went white and her jaw dropped in alarm. He was holding a child in his arms. The boy was about 8, stick-thin, all arms and legs. He was in a very deep sleep. "Look at that," Acacia remarked. "Where was he?" "Constantinople," Jace shrugged. "It's like she didn't even try." He lay the boy down on the table. Damara knelt before the twins. "I'm sorry. I never should have insulted you. I hate humans so much," Jace snarled. "There's no sincerity in any of them." "Don't be so harsh, Jace," Acacia replied. "I think Damara is ready to make amends. Aren't you, dear?" "Of course," she answered, her cheeks wet with tears. Anything Foster said would only make the situation worse. She had never felt so helpless. "Let's go outside for a bit," Acacia answered, and all of a sudden, that's exactly where they were. Out on some rocky hillside. Foster could see a village in the distance, but couldn't tell which one it was. There were a few others standing in that place, all plucked from here and there across the kingdom, all looking confused and frightened. Damara spun around, searching. "Where are they?" she asked. "The queen, my son, where are they?" Foster realized the twins had hidden her again. It seemed the people could see Damara and the twins, but couldn't see her. And she couldn't see Augustin anywhere. Perhaps the twins had left him back at the palace. "That's not important," Acacia explained. "All you need to know is that if you do exactly what we tell you, your son will wake up where we found him. He won't realize he was ever gone. If you refuse, he will assist us with our next lesson in virtue." "I'll do anything you say," Damara murmured. All at once, the whole earth shook so that the trees bowed and whipped as they were thrown asunder. Fosta instinctively fell to her knees and shielded the back of her head with her hands. There was a deafening crack, and the shaking stopped just as suddenly as it had begun. When Foster looked up, she noticed a massive split in the ground before her, forming a pit about 10 times as deep as she was tall. The tree roots sprawled outward from the earth around the perimeter, pulled from the ground as it was torn in two. Acacia offered Damara a coil of rope. Damara was still clinging to a tree she had stumbled into when the shaking began. She took the rope in a trembling hand. "What do you want me to do with this?" she asked. "Tie it to..." Acacia scanned the edge of the pit, and then pointed to one of the roots that had snarled up out of the newly formed cliff face. "That branch." Damara did so, treading carefully so she wouldn't disturb the loose soil near the edge of the chasm. "And now?" Damara pressed. Jay shot his sister a little smirk. "Climb down, and when you reach the bottom, pull the rope until the branch snaps and falls in after you." Damara glanced over the edge, wide-eyed, unable to stop shaking. "Then what?" she whispered. Jay shrugged. "I don't know. Most likely you'll die of thirst in a few days, unless a lion eats you. Or the pit floods, or a rock comes loose and crushes you," Acacia added. Foster was shaking with fury and grief, trying desperately to think of something she could say or do to save Damara. There was nothing. She had unleashed monsters on her people and was powerless to stop them. "How do I know you'll keep your promise?" Damara demanded. "How do I know you'll safely return him?" Acacia put a hand on Damara's shoulder. "You don't, but think of it this way. If you don't do what we ask, we'll take you back to Lysandria and have your head removed. Then your son will help us with one lesson after another until he's unfit to continue. As in dead," Jace clarified. "If you do what we ask, you will still die, but your son might not." Tears flooded Damara's cheeks. She looked up at the twins for a moment, fury burning in her eyes, and then, without another word, started down the rope. Chapter 23. The Woman in the Pit. There was a small village a short distance from the border. As they passed through, Alexander found himself pointing things out to Filbert and Florian. Art and architecture. He told them about Calathean customs and food and holidays. If they ever got tired of hearing it, it didn't show. But the faces of the people they passed in the streets did not mirror Alexander's happiness. On the contrary, the villagers had a bitter, weary look about them. There weren't many people outside at all, and the ones they did see seemed focused on their destination. They did not stop to speak to one another. They did not give the three strangers a second look. Alexander wished he could speak to them, but it was too soon. He couldn't risk being recognized just yet. So he left the village with Filbert and Florian and continued toward Lysandria. For a long time they passed only hills and wild land, sprawling away from the road in all directions. Then Alexander noticed the remains of a vineyard. Grapes once carefully tended were left to grow wild. Weeds and thorns pulled at the low-hanging vines, desperate to overthrow them. A little farther along they passed the remains of another field. It was now a scorched flat, decorated with stray weeds and patches of grass. All the farmland they passed was similarly destroyed or neglected. Someone has angered the gods, Florian observed, or at least Alexander thought it was Florian. In all their travels, Filbert had neglected to shave, and now Alexander couldn't tell one from the other. Just as the twin that was likely Florian finished speaking, the horses stopped. Their hooves danced up and down in place, and they started whinnying frantically. Then the earth shook. "Hold on to something," Alexander ordered. Filbert and Florian were already gripping the cart. "They know we're here," probably Florian exclaimed. "Maybe it's our own god trying to smite you," most likely Filbert suggested. "I am surprised he didn't do it years ago." Probably Florian punched him in the shoulder. "Shut up, Filbert." So that was definitely Florian. Filbert was holding the reins. Alexander noted this. "Or it could just be an earthquake," he suggested. The shaking subsided. "That's right," Florian said. "That happens here, doesn't it?" "Once in a while," Alexander replied, "though I haven't felt one like that since I was a boy." "Calathea's wonderful," Florian exclaimed. "First crab demons, now earthquakes." "But no blizzards," Alexander smiled. He jumped down and started stroking the horses, trying to calm them. "I'll walk up in front with them for a bit," he suggested. "Earthquakes usually come in sets. There might be a couple more." "Lovely," Filbert grumbled. They pushed on, with Alexander walking at the front. After a long while, he saw two men coming up the road in the opposite direction. He guessed they were farmers from the boots they wore, their calloused hands, and sun-darkened faces. One was about his age and had a mass of unkempt curls. The other was a few years older and looked as if his expression had been frozen in a permanent frown. They weren't carrying water or a pack or any of the usual things one would take on a journey. They were both silent, staring sadly at the ground as they approached. "Hello," Alexander called. "What are you doing?" Filbert whispered. "They aren't going to know me," Alexander replied. "But—" Filbert stopped himself because now the two travelers were close at hand. The younger responded to Alexander's greeting with a half-hearted wave. The elder didn't respond at all. "That was a nasty quake we had earlier. Are you all right?" "That was no earthquake," sighed the younger. "That was the gods hurling a blasphemer into the depths of the earth." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" The younger nodded sadly. "Tore the earth in half like paper and forced the poor girl down." "Forced her down?" Alexander questioned. "I thought you said they threw her down." "They did," interjected the elder. "They forced her to climb down." "Wait, they made her climb down into a pit?" "That's what I said," answered the younger. "Forced her to climb down into the depths of the earth." "Ah, but it's not exactly the same as hurling her into the depths of the earth," Alexander corrected. "What does it matter? The outcome will be the same," the younger pointed out. "Poor girl." "Will be?" Alexander asked. "She's still alive?" "She was when we left. Poor girl," the younger bemoaned. Poor girl." "Where is she?" Alexander insisted. "You're not thinking about trying to help her, are you?" the older man exclaimed. "She's been cursed by the gods," added the younger. "Where is she?" Alexander repeated. "The gods will smite you." When the elder said this, he proclaimed it like a vengeful prophet. "I'll make a deal with you," Alexander proposed. "How about you show me where she is, and then you can watch the gods smite me. I'm sure it will be quite the spectacle." "You're a madman," the elder returned. "There's a path a little ways down," the younger said, "across from an old vineyard. Take it up the hill and you'll find her." The older man glared at him. The younger shrugged. "If he wants to get himself killed, what's it to us?" "Thank you, sir," Alexander said, snatching a rope from the back of the cart. I'll see you at your execution, the younger replied cheerfully. I look forward. Alexander stopped himself. That wasn't right. I'll see you then. What did they say? Florian asked. Follow me, Alexander ordered. I'll explain on the way. Wait, where are you going? Florian called. But Alexander was already running away ahead. He heard Florian grumbling swear words and ordering Filbert to stay with the horses. It took him no time at all to catch up to Alexander. He tried to snatch him by the collar, but Alexander dodged and continued running. What are you doing? Florian cried. What did they say to you? Alexander did his best to explain without slowing down. Fine, we'll rescue this woman, but you can't just run off like that, Florian panted. Alexander was beginning to understand Ilona's desire to escape. Filbert and Florian were like overprotective parents. They had no trouble finding the pit. The trees around it were tilted or completely overturned, their roots ripped out of the earth. Alexander and Florian peered over the edge. The woman was sitting with her back to the rock face, resting her head on her knees. There was a broken tree root at her feet, with a length of rope coiled beside it. Hello, Alexander called. She looked up at him and glared, but didn't answer. There was something very familiar about her face. From such a height, it was difficult to be sure if he knew her. Are you all right? He asked. It was a stupid question given the circumstances, but he wanted her to talk to him until he could figure out how to help. Go away, she snapped. He exchanged a confused glance with Florian. I am going to get you out of there, he tried. He scanned the walls of the abyss, looking for a way to climb down. The rock face was completely smooth. Don't mock me, she shot back. I'm not mocking you, Alexander promised. The woman regarded him for a long moment. You don't know, do you? She responded. Her tone changed from one of anger to one of desperation. You must not help me. Go away. You'll be cursed. So I've been told, Alexander replied. He found a tree branch that looked sturdy enough and started tying the rope around it. I've been condemned by those demons who call themselves gods, and unless you want to become their enemy, I suggest you pretend you never saw me. Alexander gave the rope a tug to test the branch. I am already an enemy of the gods, he answered and threw the other end down. Can you climb? I'm not coming out, she called. Please go. Alexander looked at Florian. I am going to go down and talk to her. What if she recognizes you? Florian warned. Fair point, Alexander replied. Let's leave her here to die. I'll go down, Florian asserted. I'll tie her up and blindfold her. Then we can pull her out and convince her it was a good idea later. Alexander glared at him. Or I could convince her to cooperate. We can't stay here, Florian argued. What if the twins are still nearby? Do you know what Ilona will do to me if anything happens to you? Yes, Alexander replied, and I'm sorry, but we are just going to have to take that chance. Why? Because if you attempt to tie her up and she struggles and you accidentally hurt her, I'll tell Ilona about it, and heaven help you then. You insufferable little rat, Florian snapped. Alexander snatched the rope and slipped over the edge of the pit before Florian could grab him. He descended quickly, almost running backward along the rock face, holding the lead with both hands. When he was safely out of Florian's reach, he slowed a bit. What are you doing? The woman cried. I told you I'm not leaving. I only want to talk, Alexander returned. Who are you? The woman asked. Alexander Freeman, he answered. This was the most common name in Calathea. Alexander had chosen to keep his given name to reduce his chances of slipping up and revealing himself. Why do I feel like I know you? She asked. I must have one of those faces, he shrugged. He tried to glance down at her over his shoulder, but immediately stopped himself when he realized how high up he was. What's your name? He called and said. Damara Hatsi, she answered. Alexander paused his descent. He knew exactly who she was. His 4-year-old self had given her a nickname, Golden Eyes. This was because she used to wear gold-colored eye makeup, which, as a small child, he thought was a natural feature. Hearing her name took him back to one of his earliest memories. He had woken up from a nightmare, terrified. He remembered trying to sneak into Fasta's quarters and getting caught by Damara. Then he was surrounded by a pack of handmaidens, all fussing over him and pinching his cheeks and playing with his hair. And when Fasta finally appeared, not only did she allow it to continue, she actually encouraged it. Afterward, his younger self made a point to avoid Golden Eyes as much as possible. Of course, since he'd grown up, he hadn't said much to Damara aside from good morning and thank you and have you seen the princess? There was something else he remembered about her. She liked to talk. He prayed she wouldn't recognize him. Finally, when he was a short distance from the bottom, he released the rope. He turned from the wall to face her. "Justin!" she exclaimed. Alexander looked confused. "Justin?" "No," Damara realized, her eyes widening. "Prince Alexander." Alexander winced. "Who?" he asked innocently. "You look just like him," Damara observed. "Just like Prince Alexander? I've been told that." Damara scowled. "Don't mock me, Your Majesty. I know who you are. I mean, you look just like your brother." There was no denying it. He'd been caught. It was a strange thing. She recognized him so quickly, but if she hadn't told him her name, he never would have recognized her. She looked completely different without makeup. Much nicer, actually. More human. Alexander had no idea what to say or how to explain himself. "You have some nerve coming back here after what you did," she accused. "I didn't," Alexander began and sighed. "Can we discuss this later, after we get you out of here?" "I can't leave," she sniffed. "If I leave, they'll kill my son." "Oh," Alexander realized. "What if I told you they can't?" Damara glared at him. "What do you mean by that?" "Why don't we get you out of here, and then I'll explain." He noticed her closing a rock in her fist, and not a moment too soon. She hurled it at him. He dodged, but it managed to graze his ear. "Why did you do that?" he exclaimed. He heard laughing from the top of the pit. He would have shot Florian a scowl if he felt safe taking his eyes off Damara. "This is a trick, isn't it?" Damara snapped. "Those demons sent you here, didn't they? Wanted to see if I'd keep my part of the bargain. Well, I will." "Why would they send me to test you?" Alexander questioned, rubbing his ear. "You don't trust me? You don't really know me. I doubt you thought much about me since I left." Damara pondered this for a moment, eyeing him suspiciously. Alexander offered her a hand. She wanted to believe him. He could see it in her eyes. She was also terrified. She took his hand, and he pulled her to her feet. She winced when she put her weight on her ankle. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "The branch broke before I reached the bottom, but I'm all right." Alexander made a loop in the rope and instructed her to sit in it and hold on to the lead with both hands. He hoped she could at least manage that. She did as he said, and then he called up to Florian. "What ungodly tongue is that?" she demanded. He suddenly realized he had spoken in Celtic. But before Alexander could respond, Florian started pulling the rope, drawing Damara up out of the pit. He hoped she wouldn't be alarmed to find a barbarian waiting for her. That is the end of chapter 23. Next time we will read chapter 24, and we'll meet some more Faustas and maidens. See you next time!